Hello and welcome back to another GCSE revision video. Now, I want to go over the character of Juliet in Romeo and Juliet. Now, lots of people tend to underestimate her character and really present her as just this love-struck teen. And really, one of the things that when it comes to Juliet's character that a lot of people overlook is the complexity in her character. And actually, remember that the way she is portrayed as actually being very practical, quite intelligent and quite logical. She actually is far more logical and rational than even Romeo himself. In fact, Romeo, who acts on his emotions, this is what leads him to eventually be banished from Verona, okay? So Juliet actually is a really interesting and somewhat complex character. And of course, given that she's one of the main characters in this play, you should always anticipate a potential question on her if you were studying Romeo and Juliet, and thus you need to be able to make some really powerful and robust GCSE points if you want to do really well if you get a Juliet character question in your Romeo and Juliet mock exams or ultimately your Romeo and Juliet final exams. So I want to show you the 3 heavy hitting points you can make in any GCSE Romeo and Juliet essay on the character of Juliet. And of course, I'm going to talk about also the quotes that go with it and what you can say in connection to each of these points. So your first winning point, your first grade 9 point on the character of Juliet, let's say she is the question you are answering. On Romeo and Juliet, you have to mention how she is portrayed as maturing quite rapidly. What's actually interesting is her transformation from being quite childlike to actually showing a great level of maturity happens really, really rapidly. In fact, it happens quite early on in the play, soon after she meets Romeo, okay? So prior to meeting Romeo, she is portrayed as being quite passive and obedient, especially to her parents. And her parents obviously expressed to her that they want her to marry Paris. And she shows that she's quite passive. She is willing to accept whatever their demands are when she states, "I'll look to like if looking liking more," okay? And when she says this, what this demonstrates is just how passive and obedient she is. She's almost like this child who's being instructed on what to do by her parents really early on in the play before she meets Romeo. And this change in her character happens quite soon after she meets Romeo and falls in love with him. And when she says, "My only love sprung from my only hate," of course, this is after the nurse informs her and tells her that Romeo is a Montague, she actually demonstrates a shift towards having an independent mindset. She demonstrates a shift away from just not questioning what her parents ask and listening passively to what they tell her, to actually exercising a high degree of independence and falling in love with Romeo's character. It's really important to remember that she matures quite rapidly in the play, and you want to talk about that. You want to highlight that when you're talking about Juliet's character. Go beyond just making really basic points and saying, Juliet falls in love with Romeo. We can see she loves Romeo. Okay, but what does that show her? And also her actively picking her love for Romeo. Well, this demonstrates now, this is where you're going into analysis, that she is showing a real maturity in her character, okay? And a real independence, which was something that actually would have been quite shocking for an Elizabethan audience at the time, because women were expected to be quite passive and listen to what their parents wanted. And actually, once her love is triggered for Romeo, she changes and shows this independent thought. That's your first point. That's your first winning point on any essay on Juliet's character. Now, your second point, your second winning point is to do with how she is portrayed by Shakespeare as an intelligent, free thinker. And by the way, if you want a free downloadable of this, I actually post quite regularly on Substack, which is an online blog. I post on there very, very regularly. And I tend to put, model answers. I tend to put mind maps on things like Romeo and Juliet, but even language paper 1, paper 2, and different literature topics. So I've actually created a post on this that you can also download if you want something that's quite nifty, quite useful for Romeo and Juliet. And you simply just access that by going on to First Rate Tutor's Substack. The link is in the description. Anyway, so your second point in terms of why she's an intelligent free thinker is how Shakespeare portrays and depicts her as being quite intelligent, practical, and thoughtful as she questions social conventions. In other words, Juliet, once she falls in love with Romeo, this really triggers a really rapid change in her, and she starts actually questioning all the things that she was previously taught to be true, i.e. if you're a Capulet, you must hate Montagues unquestioningly. If you are from this family, you must be unquestioningly loyal to your family. She questions this, and we can see despite being surrounded only by Capulets, she's actually still able to think for herself and to question, why should I hate this man who I love just because he's a Montague? In fact, she shows this in this quotation. What's in a name? Obviously, this is a really powerful rhetorical question. This demonstrates that Juliet has a high degree of independent, intelligent, free thinking in her capacity. And of course, Shakespeare portrays her in this way. And this is what adds to her being a very complex character. And you want to talk about this, okay? So when you're analyzing her character, you want to mention how she's portrayed as really questioning social conventions. Now, your third and final winning point with Romeo and Juliet is, of course, how her courage makes her a tragic hero. Remember, obviously, this play is a tragedy. And of course, this play ends with the deaths of both Romeo and Juliet. Now, what's really interesting in terms of her death in the play is she is shown through her action, not only of trying to fake her death initially so that she can get out of the marriage to Paris and be able to go to Mantua and escape Verona and live with Romeo and have their happy ever after, but actually even her act of killing herself once she realizes that Romeo has died shows that she is questioning the patriarchal order at the time. Patriarchy simply means a society that's guided and led by men. At the time, she in the society that she lived in, she was told who she should marry, especially by her father, Lord Capulet, and by the men around her. She was told what she can and can't do. But actually, when she decides not only to fall in love with Romeo, but once she realizes that Romeo is dead, she then goes one step further and also says, okay, I'm gonna die as well because this is not worth my life and I'm not happy being alive and marrying Paris. This is a real act of defiance and disobedience, and she is questioning the patriarchal order at the time. And thus her act of suicide at the end is actually a really powerful message. It demonstrates how she's willing to risk both her family and life for her true love. And of course, this is shown in the quotation, "Oh happy dagger." This exclamatory sentence is so powerful in demonstrating how Juliet actually becomes a tragic hero in our eyes, and we can see her going against her fate but still exercising this final act of free will. You need to talk about that. And of course, if you're looking at this and you're like, okay, this is really helpful, thank you so much for sharing this, but how does this look like in an essay? Let's say you struggle putting this in a really solid grade 9 essay. During half term, on the 2nd of November, I'm going to be running a one-off Romeo and Juliet GCSE masterclass. And in this live lesson, not only will I go over a grade 9 model essay and how to write a model answer on Romeo and Juliet, but also be sharing a 3-page cheat sheet on how that you can use not only for your upcoming mocks, but for your final Romeo and Juliet GCSE exams. And also, because that's going to be a live lesson, you can ask me as many questions as you want. So if you want just a little bit more, just simply join in. That half term GCSE masterclass is going to be on the 2nd of November. So that's really it, and I hope you found this useful.